Hi, I'm Morgie Benefit. I'm a sophomore here at Northern. I'm an international business major and an entrepreneurial studies minor, and I'm also an honors entrepreneur, so I encourage all of you guys to apply. So, I'd like to introduce Dr. Arthur M. Diamond Jr. He earned his graduate degrees in philosophy and economics from the University of Chicago, where he was also awarded a postdoctoral fellowship with Economics Nobel Prize laureate Gary Becker. Dr. Diamond is currently a professor of economics at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He frequently teaches graduate seminars on the economics of entrepreneurship as well as the economics of technology. Dr. Diamond has published many journal articles on issues in labor economics, economics of technology, and economics of entrepreneurship. In 2019, his book titled Openness to Creative Destruction, Sustaining Innovative Dynamism will be published by Oxford University Press. Now, please welcome Dr. Diamond.
I want to start out by thanking Dr. Mance for inviting me, and I want to also thank Morgan for the great introduction. And I want to thank all of you for spending some time with me. I'm really looking forward to this because I like talking about what I care about, and what I care about is innovation and entrepreneurship. And I'm going to try to spend the next hour telling you a few things that I think I've learned over the years as I've worked on this. And I've got it, as Morgan mentioned, I have a book that I'm working on. I once tried to summarize in an hour the whole book. I talked extremely fast, and I only got 2/3 the way through, and I felt as though I learned a lesson. The lesson is I can't talk about the whole book in an hour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of what I think are the main lessons of the book. And I want to the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about some innovative entrepreneurs and some inventors, and then say what we can learn from them. Now, you might want to ask, the natural question is, why is it worth your while to think about innovation and entrepreneurship? And there's more than one way to answer it, but I'll tell you what I think is the strongest and most important answer. And to give you that answer, you have to step back a little bit in time, way back in time, and you could step back further than this graph. This graph goes back to year 0, but you could go back 40,000 years at least, because the point that this graph makes, and the point that you could extend back further in time, is that human life, for a lot of the history of humans, hasn't been all that great. This tells you how much per capita GDP there was. It is per person. Basically, you can think of this as what was the income per person in different years going in the past. And the person who spent this guy Angus Madison spent much of his life collecting this data for Britain. And you look down there, and it was pretty low for thousands of years, and you go back 40,000 years, people have estimated differently. Some say it's $1 a day, maybe sometimes when things were going well, $2 a day. And that continued century after century after century after century for thousands of years. Humans have been around, at least humans like us, Homo sapiens, humans with our intelligence and characteristics, have been around at least for 40,000 years, and some say 200,000 years. Almost all of that time, life has been poor, nasty, brutish, and short, to quote Thomas Hobbes. But something happened here, something wonderful, something unexpected, something not totally easy to understand. That's about the year 1800. That's about the time that the Industrial Revolution started, especially in Europe and especially in Britain and in Holland. And the question then is, what's the key to understanding the Industrial Revolution? And there's different answers to that. As you might think, that's a really important issue. Deirdre McCloskey called it the great fact. And the great fact, if you want to describe it visually, is the hockey stick. The hockey stick shows you that for a long time there's misery, and that within a blink of an eye, in terms of the length of humanity's existence, life got a little better. Now, why did it get better? Some people say, well, it's inevitable. But if it's inevitable, why did it take so long? I say it's not inevitable. I say it happened because people made it happen. And the people who were most important in making it happen are the breakthrough inventors and the innovative entrepreneurs, who are the main focus of this presentation. And what I'm going to do today, with the little time that I have with you, is to talk about 6 main examples, and I'm going to throw in a couple of other examples. And I'm going to highlight these mostly entrepreneurs, but a couple of them are mostly inventors. I'm going to tell you just a couple stories about their lives, and then I'm going to try to draw some lessons from each of their lives. Lessons about how we could have encouraged what they did, how we can encourage that same kind of wonderful result in other people, and also what they did themselves, what was different about them in their choices and in their character and in their habits that helped make them the innovators or the entrepreneurs that they were. So that's the plan for the next hour. I want to start out with somebody way back. A couple of people I'm going to start out with, but I'm going to focus mainly on Filippo Brunelleschi. He had a kind of a competitive thing going with this other person, Lorenzo Ghiberti, and that went on for much of their lives. The highlight of it was when they competed to get to be the designers, the sculptors for the bronze doors of the great new cathedral in Florence at the beginning of the period when Florence was going to prosper as the heart of the Renaissance, the reawakening. And they were going to tear down the old cathedral and build a wonderful, bigger, more impressive new one. The entrance to it was the most important part, at least one of the important parts. They wanted these bronze doors to be the best possible, each panel representing a great scene from the Bible. They had a competition. Several sculptors, artists applied and submitted a sample panel. Ghiberti and Brunelleschi applied. The panel of judges decided they couldn't decide. They said, these are both wonderful. We're going to call it a tie, and you're each going to get to do half of it. Brunelleschi was mad. Brunelleschi said, I'm either going to do it all or I'm not going to do any of it. I quit. So he stepped down from that, and he began a period of wandering, but directed, focused wandering around Europe, looking at great architectural accomplishments from the past. And then what he did eventually was he came back to Florence, and he competed to be the main architect responsible for the main stages of building what is called the Duomo, the dome. It's now called Brunelleschi's dome in honor of him. This was a long project, a long-term project in Florence. And one of the neat things about this project is they laid the foundation for a very large dome. The foundation that they laid was so big that no one at that time knew how to build a dome as big as the foundation was implying would be built. And yet they still laid the foundation. Now, why is that neat? I think it's neat because it tells you something about the spirit of the Renaissance. It tells you something about the spirit of innovative entrepreneurs. And that is, very often, innovative entrepreneurs start off on a project before they know how they're going to do it. They have a confidence or maybe a determination that they'll figure it out along the way, and they'll figure out a way to get it done, but they don't at the moment know how that'll happen. And the wonderful thing about this story is Brunelleschi did it. He figured it out, and you can see how he did it. If you get to Florence and you walk up, they have little displays about what he did. What are the lessons from Brunelleschi? Well, one lesson is you can recover from a setback. If you lose a job, like you lose the panel to Ghiberti, it's possible for a person to retool. It's possible for a person to end up doing something even better than if they hadn't suffered the setback. That's one lesson. Another lesson is that breakthrough innovations, often you start before you know how you're going to solve it. We mentioned that. And then finally, related to that, I think is a policy implication that's relevant to us today. Underlying regulations of innovators and inventors today, increasingly, we're using something called the precautionary principle. Now, what is the precautionary principle? The precautionary principle says you are not allowed to innovate unless you can prove in advance that your innovation will not cause anyone harm. But you see the problem there? The problem is if you're doing a project as ambitious as Brunelleschi, where you don't know how you're going to do it till you start working on it, there's no way you can prove in advance that it won't cause harm because you can't show the method that you're going to use to do it. There's a neat book by a guy named Cass Sunstein. He was, for a few years, several years maybe, head of an agency related to regulation in the Barack Obama administration. He's written a book on the precautionary principle, and in this book he says all kinds of great things that we care about and that have made our lives better would never have come into existence if the precautionary principle had been in effect. He's talking about vaccines against terrible diseases. He's talking about airplanes. He's talking about steam engines, steam locomotives. He's talking about air conditioning. He's talking about elevators. All of these innovations, before they were done, people didn't know exactly how they would be done, and so they wouldn't have been able to satisfy the conditions of the precautionary principle. Cass Sunstein is worried that if we do that, we won't have more Duomos, we won't have more vaccines, we won't have all of the great things that required a certain spirit of adventure and confidence and willingness to step where we don't know quite where we're going to end up. The next inventor, entrepreneur that I want to talk about is George Stephenson. George Stephenson was born very poor. He was the son of a coal miner. Coal mining was then, it is now still, but especially back then, it was a terribly dangerous job to have. All kinds of coal miners would die from all kinds of accidents, including walking into areas of the mine where unexpectedly there were toxic gases that you couldn't breathe. He went into the mines himself. He had almost no education, but he taught himself. He improved his ability to read. He read voraciously. He read engineering. He read physics and science. He became what's called an autodidact, which means a self-taught person. He worked in a mine, and he got a job because he had done the reading and studying. He was the best person they could find to take care of the simple Newcomen pump that was crucial to the mine. He said, what's a Newcomen pump? A Newcomen pump was a predecessor to the famous Watts steam engine, and it was simple but effective at doing a key job that mines needed to have done, which was to remove the water so that you could go into the mines. And what he did was he maintained the Newcomen pump for a mine. He would, every week, at the end of the week, he would take it apart, he would lubricate it, he would see how it worked, and he would fix small problems, and he learned as he did that. He practiced and he worked, and he got to the point where he could actually make improvements in it. And he got to the points where he said, well, you know, this could be used, and an extension of this kind of technology could be used for motive power, because they had tracks taking the coal out of the mines, but what they had carts. The carts were not pulled by steam engines, they were pulled by mules or horses. He said, why don't we have something that's more efficient and that will be able to pull more easily? And he worked on the locomotive. And up here you can see the most famous of his locomotives is the rocket. It doesn't look much like a rocket, but he was ambitious at naming just as he was at invention. They had a competition with 5 or 6 different designs for locomotives, and the crowd favorite was the prettiest one. That one, the novelty, as often is the case, but also as is often the case in life, the prettiest isn't the one that has the most staying power, that has the most substance. And in this case, the novelty and all the other competitors stopped running before the course was finished. The one that kept going, the one that was built to last, so to speak, was the rocket. And so he's given credit as being the inventor of an effective locomotive. He didn't just invent, though. He also was one of these people who not only invents, but carries forward to be an entrepreneur. And what's the difference? The inventor shows that something's technologically possible. The entrepreneur is somebody who takes something that's been achieved technologically and figures out ways to make it cheaply enough and well enough in a way that people are willing to pay for it. In other words, the entrepreneur goes that huge extra step of making it available to a wide group of consumers so that it benefits the world. And he did that partly by, he set up, along with his son, the first locomotive factory in the world. But he also figured out better ways to lay track, because it's not just enough to have a locomotive. If you don't have track going places people want to go in a safe, effective way, then it doesn't do you any good to have a locomotive. So what he did was he did some very challenging engineering tasks. For instance, there was a bog that went for several miles that was on a key route between 2 cities. People thought there's no way you're ever going to lay track that a train can run over because it'll sink into the bog, right? And he worked on it longer than what he had hoped, longer than what his backers had hoped. Fortunately, the backers didn't give up on him. He tried one thing, he tried another. He finally figured out ways to build up the bog sufficiently so that the track and the train wouldn't sink. and it's viewed as one of the great engineering achievements that made train travel possible. So he is one, we don't hear much about him anymore, but he was one of the great early inventors and entrepreneurs. And what lessons can we learn from Stephenson? The book on the right is, if you ever want to read more about him, it's by Samuel Smiles. People don't read him anymore. You can get his book for free on Kindle because it's out of copyright. And he wrote books about early inventors and entrepreneurs, and he drew lessons about their lives, what we can learn and emulate. One lesson that Smiles emphasizes, and Stephenson himself emphasized, is that a key to success in entrepreneurship and invention is, with a single word, perseverance. Genius is great, inspiration is great, high IQ is great, but what matters most is that you don't give up. That's perseverance. The story is that Winston Churchill gave the best commencement address ever, and looked like he was asleep, but they finally nudged him and he got up, and so according to the story, his commencement address was, "Never, never, never give up." And then he sat down. I'm not sure the story's true, but it should be true. What else can we learn from George Stephenson? If you're motivated and want to learn, there's a lot you can teach yourself, and that's good news in terms of opportunity, right? And what's true then would be even more true today, because Stephenson didn't have access to the Khan Academy's 5-minute YouTube videos on almost anything you'd want to learn, right? And you have access to that. Stephenson didn't. What people can learn if they want to is pretty enormous. A final lesson is that, and we're going to see this with some of the others, is that entrepreneurship and invention can be a path forward for people who are poor outsiders. And that's something we care a lot about, right? Is opportunity for people who don't have a very high station in life, people who are not currently successful. We want there to be a path where they can improve their lives. And a lot of times capitalism gets a bad rap on that score. But at least one kind of capitalism, the kind I'm talking about, entrepreneurial capitalism, does provide a route, more than one route, and has provided a route for people to really make something of their lives, and in the process do good for the rest of the world too. And that's what Stephenson did. I want to talk for a minute about Jacob Davis. And Jacob Davis is the inventor of Levi's jeans. And I'll say in a moment why they're not called Davis jeans. But he was an immigrant. He was poor. He was an outsider. He moved from place to place trying different occupations. He finally was making a living, not a great living, but making a living as a tailor. And what he was mainly doing, this was I think in Nevada, maybe Reno, I can't remember for sure, but I think Reno. And he was making blankets for horses. They weren't fancy, but they were tough blankets that were durable and did the job. And one of his techniques for making these blankets, which I guess was not unknown at that time, was to use rivets at the places where the blanket was most likely to come apart to strengthen the blanket. Well, what happened was one day a poor woman came in and said to him that she was really desperate because her family didn't have enough food and other necessities of life because her husband was not able to work. And the reason he wasn't able to work was he kept going through the pants that he was wearing, and they would keep falling apart, and he couldn't go to a job without work pants. And she wondered, she didn't have much to pay him, but she said, "I'll pay you what I can if you can make a sturdy pair of work pants so my husband can get a job and stay working so we can have food on the table." So he thought about that and thought about what could he do after she left, and he looked over to the horse blankets, and he saw the rivets, and he had an idea. He thought, okay, well, if the rivets strengthen the horse blankets, maybe the rivets could also strengthen the key parts of work pants so that they don't fall apart as quickly. So he grabbed some of the rivets and he grabbed some of the jean material and he started working. He put the rivets in some of the places that were weakest, like pockets was an area where they fell apart quickly. So he put rivets there and put rivets in other places. The jean we now know as Levi's was born. Now, he had tried to patent some other things that he'd thought of in life, and so he'd used a lot of the family money for that, and he didn't have much left to take out a patent on this idea. So what he did was he thought, maybe I can partner with somebody else who can help me with that aspect. And he had heard about and knew a little about Levi Strauss in San Francisco. So I can't remember, I think he went there with some of these genes, and he was able to get an appointment, and he said, here, these are selling well. Once I sold them to the woman, it worked for her husband. She was delighted and came back and told me that. She told all her friends, I now have more orders for these than I can make. How about you help me take out a patent, and you help me manufacture these, and you sell them, and we share in the earnings. And Levi Strauss could have, maybe he could have stolen the idea if he was tricky, but he said, yes, this is a good idea. And he reached an agreement with Davis and started manufacturing these wonderful genes. So that's the story of Jacob Davis. What are the lessons? Jacob Davis is what I call a free agent entrepreneur. I distinguish free agent entrepreneurs from innovative entrepreneurs. A free agent entrepreneur is the person who works for themselves. What Daniel Pink calls, he's the one who came up with the label free agent. He has a book called Free Agent Nation. And Jacob Davis was a tailor. He worked for himself, mainly doing what other people had already done before. That's what makes it not so innovative. An innovative entrepreneur is somebody who works for themselves, but they're doing something that's never been done before. But one point I want to make from Jacob Davis's life is that Jacob Davis shows that there's not a sharp dividing line between free agent and innovative entrepreneur, that all of us, no matter what we start out doing, can keep alert to opportunities to innovate, as he did when he took that rivet and put it in the pants. He crossed the line from being a free agent entrepreneur to being an innovative entrepreneur. It's a continuum. And most of the people that I'm going to talk about who became, I think all of them, if I looked into it enough, who became innovative entrepreneurs, if you looked into their backgrounds, you'd find or stages at some point in their life where they were free agent entrepreneurs. Many of the people who were great innovative entrepreneurs eventually, for instance, were newspaper boys or girls earlier in their life, right? A lot of times they did other kinds of basic work for themselves kinds of jobs. And that teaches basic skills that are useful to any entrepreneur, including innovative entrepreneurs. If you're selling papers, you have to sell more papers so that you bring in the revenue to pay for the costs you incurred when you bought the papers at the beginning of the day. So you learn something about how business works. Another point is that, again, entrepreneurship, invention can be a path by which the poor can improve their lives. They can improve their lives for themselves, but they can also, by doing the innovations, they're improving the lives of other poor people as well. Finally, not every great innovation requires some wild insight. Sometimes and this involves some luck, that the solution to your problem is sitting right there on the table next to you, as it was with him with the blankets right next to the material for the pants. But it does require something in addition to just the luck of juxtaposition. It requires alertness. It requires carrying around with you problems that need to be solved and the eyes to see a potential solution. And sometimes it takes the perseverance and courage to pursue the possible solution and see if you can actually make it work. So those are some lessons from Jacob Davis. This is, I'm not sure my pronunciation, Guglielmo, that's my best effort. But from now on, I'll just call him Marconi. Marconi was the person responsible for sending telegraph waves across the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. He was not born in a poor family. He was lucky enough to be born in a family that was fairly well off. He was homeschooled, and his mother homeschooled him. His father provided him with resources when he wanted it to pursue his hobby or passion, which was tinkering with mechanisms, especially related to electricity. That's what he did from a very early age. And at a fairly young age, I think in his teens, he started doing transmission, short distances of telegraph signals. As he got older, he decided to be more ambitious, and he went to England and set up towers to try and broadcast a signal, and he got people to set up towers over in Canada to send signals across the Atlantic. And it was very dubious that this could be done. The physics of the day said it was impossible. The physics said that kind of wave, if you're sitting on a globe, which we all are, and you send a wave out from some point on the globe, it's going to go in a straight line, which means it's not going to curve around the Earth and land someplace across an ocean. It's going to go into outer space, right? So he was on a fool's mission. He was an ignoramus who didn't know physics, right? Well, he probably knew a little bit of physics, but he didn't take it too seriously. He tried it, and it worked. And then the physics had to be revised to catch up with what he had actually done. So that's a nutshell, a little bit about Marconi. Now, what can you learn from him? One is that it's better off, you can be better off for true breakthrough innovations sometimes if you either don't know the theory, so you don't know it's impossible, or if you know it, you have a certain healthy skepticism toward theory, knowing that theories are revised, they're sometimes refuted, and that sometimes it's worth trying something even if the current theory says it's impossible. And that's the case with Marconi. He went ahead and tried it, and turned out it worked. Who else are we going to talk about? My favorite innovative entrepreneur is Walt Disney. And this is a book that, there's many, many, many books about Walt Disney, but I'm here to tell you that I think the best one is this one by Michael Barrier, and this is the one that I rely on most for the story, little bit of stories I'm going to tell you about Walt Disney. Walt Disney's father tried a lot of different jobs and enterprises and was not hugely successful in any of them, but he kept trying. Walt, from a very early age, started to do cartooning and to sketch on his pad. When he was a young man, he was, of course, a paper boy when he was younger, but as a young man, he set up a little studio to make short cartoon advertisements that would be intended to run before movies of the day. And he worked hard at it, had some success, but the costs of his little business were higher than the revenue, and he was going under. He didn't give up easy. He couldn't afford an apartment, so he slept in a cot in his little office. He couldn't afford food, hardly, so all he lived on were cans of beans for a long time. And his family, his friends, were worried that he wasn't going to make it physically because he was wasting away. He was skeletal. Later in life, he used to say, well, it really wasn't so bad. I like beans. He went bankrupt. He went under, in spite of his trying. He then decided to move to California and try again. One of his uncles was in California and had been reasonably successful at something in California. One of his older brothers was there because he had tuberculosis and he was in a sanitarium to recover from tuberculosis. So he had some relatives there. He went, and his uncle lent him his garage to set up his first of what turned out to be a successful enterprise of a studio. His brother came on board after he got better from tuberculosis as the financial side of the Disney company. And he started out doing cartoons that were successful. His first successful cartoon character was, I'm going to come back to the picture up there, but this is Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. You've all heard of Oswald, right? That's his first major breakthrough in terms of a successful cartoon character. And he had several cartoons that were very popular with Oswald. He had a distributor. He wasn't into this. He didn't have a big enough operation to do distributing, so he had done a contract with a distributor to distribute it. And he went to discuss future animated cartoons that he was going to develop with using this character. He went to New York, where the distributor was, to talk about it. The distributor didn't like Walt's plans and wanted him to do something totally different with Oswald. Disney said, that's out of character. That's not who Oswald is. I won't do it. So the distributor said, well, then Oswald is no longer yours, Walt. And Walt was stunned, and the distributor said, look at the contract you signed. We have the right, at our choice, to take over. They took over, and Oswald was taken away from Walt, which discouraged him some. But he was a hard person to keep down. So on the train trip back to California, he started doodling, as he often did in life, and he shortened the ears of Oswald, and he changed the tail. And he came up with a character looking something like this, named Mortimer. And he mentioned to his wife, as he showed her Mortimer, he said, here's what the new character I'm going to try to develop, Mortimer Mouse. And she said, get rid of Mortimer, the name Mortimer. Mortimer's not, you need something friendly, something people will embrace. something like Mickey. So Mickey Mouse became Oswald with a changed tail and changed ears. Right? And that illustrates something worth illustrating, I think, and we'll say what in a minute. But just to finish the story about Oswald, in case you want to know how it turned out in the longer run, the very long run. After 78 years, what happened was, 78 years, Oswald belonged to somebody else. But after 78 years, somebody new took over the Disney company as CEO, a guy named Robert Iger. And this was as a result of a coup where a combination of Walt's nephew, Roy Jr., and a guy named Steve Jobs, who cared about Disney too, they organized a coup to throw out the previous CEO and put Bob Iger in. Iger had more the spirit of the Walt Disney brand, they thought, and a lot of other people thought. When Iger took over, they were negotiating with Universal to send Universal a sportscaster that Universal wanted, and they had reached pretty much an agreement on it. And then Iger said near the end, he said, well, we're ready to sign on the dotted line, but there's one more thing we want. We want Oswald back. And so the appeal to Universal, they said, Oswald? Who's Oswald? And so they said, oh, sure, you want that cartoon character we're not using? Sure, we'll sign Oswald over. So after 78 years, Oswald came back to the Walt Disney Company after 78 years in the wilderness. And if you wander into the right gift shop in Orlando, you can acquire a pair of these. And you can also, I had a picture of me talking to the Oswald character walking around too, but I don't want to push this too far. What can you learn from Walt Disney? You can learn that as with the Oswald story, successful entrepreneurs and inventors have to make nimble adjustments. Things don't work out right away. You have to try different things, and you have to keep at it. And that's what he did when he changed Oswald into Mickey. That's what he did when he didn't let the bankruptcy stop him forever. What else can we learn? Some innovative entrepreneurs are motivated by desire to be rich. Some are motivated by a desire to be famous. Some are motivated by a desire to win in competition and be number one. And then there's people like Walt Disney. And I want to go back now to that slide a couple back. I call Walt Disney and some other entrepreneurs project entrepreneurs. And what distinguishes them is what they're mainly motivated about is the desire to see a project make it into the world that they care about. And why do I think he was that kind of a person? Well, if you can see pictures. I don't have one here, but it's easy to Google pictures of his home. His home was a nice home, but it was not at all spectacular, not at all impressive. The only thing unusual about his house was that it had this train going around it, that he liked to go out whenever anybody visited him, and he'd say, hey, let's go for a ride on my little train. So he'd go out on his little train. His wife was worried because his wife was afraid they would get sued when it fell over and if somebody got hurt, which did fall over fairly often. So what Walt would do is he wouldn't put his money into big houses or yachts. There's people who do that. Jim Clark is an entrepreneur who created Silicon Graphics and some other companies. His goal, according to Michael Lewis in The New Thing, was always to have the biggest yacht in the world. That was not Walt Disney's goal. When Walt Disney made money from Snow White, he put that money into other films. When he had the money from the other films, he decided he wanted an amusement park that he could feel proud to take his daughters to instead of the sleazy, run-down ones that were the only option. So he got all these ideas and started drawing and thinking about it and making plans to build a theme park. And he took them to his brother, who was the chief financial officer, with these plans. And he said, Walt, you're crazy. That'll never make any money. That's really risky. We can't afford to do that. We're already overextended in the movie projects we've got going. And they argued back and forth. And finally, Walt said, well, I'm going to do it. And if I can't do it within the Walt Disney Company, I'm quitting. So Walt Disney quit the Walt Disney Company, and he created a new little company called WED. His middle name was Elias. His dad's name was Elias. So it's Walter Elias Disney, WED. So he's working for this little startup, WED, And he's working on making this steam pipe. Now, he doesn't have any money, right? Because all the money's in the big corporation that his brother is now left in charge of. And so how does he fund it? He cashes in his wife's and his insurance policy. She was really angry. He said, he mentioned years later how, and she had a right to be, right? I mean, she said, you don't have any savings, Walt. You put all your money back into your business. The insurance policy is all we've got if something happens to you. But he cashed that in to pursue Disneyland. So Roy observed this, and at some point Roy just put up his hands, as he eventually always did, and said, well, Walt, it's clear you're stubborn. You're not going to give in. I think it's crazy, but okay, bring all back in the main company, and we'll try to do it within the main Walt Disney Company. And so he did that. And, of course, Walt made it work. When Disneyland was finally built, he had turned all the assets over, but there was one asset he kept for his own little company, WED. And that asset was the train. If you ever go to Disneyland, you got to ride on the train. And remember that was what Walt cared about more than anything. So he was a project entrepreneur, and I think project entrepreneurs matter. Why do project entrepreneurs matter? I think they matter because in some ways I think it's more noble if you are doing entrepreneurship because you want to make what Jobs called a ding in the universe. If you want to move the world forward to make it a better place, if that's your motive, I think there's something noble about that. That's one reason I think project entrepreneurs matter. But another reason I think they matter is because I think just in terms of the likelihood of success, project entrepreneurs are more likely to succeed. Why is that? Other entrepreneurs, if your goal is like Jim Clark's, that you want to always be the one with the biggest yacht in the world, you're going to be tempted to sell out too quick. If you care about the project, you're going to stick with it because you want the project to flourish. And even if you don't make as much money as you might have, it's the project that you're living for, not the money. You want the money because the money helps enable the project. So it's not that you're indifferent to money, but the money is a means to your project. It's not an end in itself. And that's the project entrepreneur. Other lessons. Innovative entrepreneurs persevere, and that's often a key to their eventual success. He's one more example of that. And finally, at key stages, they're self-funded. Whether the self-funding comes in terms of money or letting somebody use your garage. His case, family. Some people in his family mortgaged and double mortgaged their houses to put it in to what he was doing. His family was supportive, and he put everything he had, including his life insurance, into self-funding his most ambitious breakthrough projects. I want to talk about Nick Steinsberger. And Nick Steinsberger is somebody that you probably haven't heard of, but he's somebody who was a key person in the fracking revolution in terms of extracting a rich, cheap supply of natural gas from the earth. He worked for a company called Mitchell, and Mitchell is one of the famous companies that is involved in fracking. This book, The Frackers, is a wonderful book that gives the story of some of the people who mattered most in making fracking happen. And part of what's included in The Frackers is a discussion about how so few experts in energy, basically none, of the people who are the economics of energy, who are the engineering experts, all the forecasters and experts didn't see fracking happen. And that's an interesting fact in and of itself, is that many breakthrough innovations, nobody who is supposed to understand what's going on, except the people making it happen themselves. Sometimes even they weren't sure it would happen, but they were the only ones who had an idea of what would happen. In this book, Mitchell Energy Company is highlighted as one of the key places. He worked for Mitchell Energy. Now, what did he do? He was the person who's given credit for being behind a key technique that made fracking so successful, and that's slick water fracturing. What you do with fracking is you pump a mixture of some chemicals and water into the cracks, and you use that to expand the cracks and to get the natural gas out. Key to doing this is to have the right mixture. He was supervising a fracturing operation with a new site, and he found out that they had messed up. They had you're supposed to have a certain level of viscosity, of thickness of the mixture. And he found that what they had screwed up doing was they put too much water in the mixture. And he said, this is going to be bad. I'm going to be blamed for this. We're going to lose money on this well, and gee, this is really a bad day. But they had gone too far. They couldn't take the mixture out once they pumped it in, so they had to do the best they could. So then they started to work it and see what happened. Well, it turned out they were stunned. It was hugely productive, way more, because the theory said that it shouldn't work that way with this kind of mixture, but it did. It was much waterier than the usual mixture, and it was extremely spectacularly productive. And then the question is, where do you go from there? Well, everybody else who was around observing this in Mitchell kind of shrugged and said, well, life's full of occasional surprises that you never quite understand, that sometimes you call it a fluke, some one-off result. And so they just kind of shrugged and said, well, we'll keep on doing what we're doing. But he had a hunch that something unusual and informative and repeatable had happened that shouldn't be lost, that you need to grab hold of and take advantage of and repeat. And so he, in spite of theory disagreeing, and in spite of the fact that he had to fight everybody in the Mitchell organization, he took this forward and they said, you're crazy. There was one expert above him in rank who said, this is a stupid idea, Nick. And if you turn out to be successful, I'll eat my diploma. This was somebody who had a degree from Harvard or one of the Ivies, right? But Nick wouldn't give up, and he was scared. He was really anxious. He couldn't sleep at night because he had 2 or 3 young children. They had just taken out a big mortgage on a new house they had just bought. His wife had a decent job, but if he lost his job, her income by itself wouldn't be enough to pay the mortgage. They would be really in a bad spot, and it looked like he was doing something that had a high chance of him losing his job. So the prudent thing for him to have done, the responsible thing for him to have done probably would to have caved. But he didn't. He kept arguing, and he found enough people at Mitchell who were willing to give it a shot to say, okay, we'll let you try it on 1 or 2 more sites if you're so determined to do that. So they gave him a chance to try it. And it turned out it worked again, and it worked again, and it worked again. And finally, even the guy who was going to eat his diploma, he reneged on that, by the way. Even he said, well, yeah, I think there's something to this slick water fracturing that you were talking about, Nick. And the theorists about how fracturing worked, they worked on their theory and tweaked it, and they came up with reasons why, yeah, you were right, it could work. They only came up with that after he had gone out and done it. So what lessons are there from Nick's experience? Well, Nick, one I think conclusion you can reach is that, and this is something we saw before with Jacob Davis. Sometimes the key components of the innovation are right before your eyes, but you have to be alert, and it's more than alertness. For Davis, it was mainly alertness. Nobody was going to get mad at him for trying to use rivets, right, in the genes. But in this case, Nick had to be alert, and he had to have courage, because he could well have lost his job. That was a real possibility. So you needed to be alert. You didn't have to have special genius. He didn't have to be a genius, but he had to have open eyes, and he had to have a backbone. And that's something that is useful to know for those of us who don't think of ourselves as geniuses, what you need to have. Another lesson, all of these components for this to have happened, the serendipitous events, the hunches, the courage, these are not predictable. Maybe not even by the person themselves. If you read this book that I mentioned a little back, he says that Nick himself wasn't sure he had the courage to stick with it. He wasn't sure he'd stick with the hunch. He did, but he might not have predicted that he would. So a corollary to this lesson is this lesson. If you can't predict these big breakthroughs, then the people who advocate central planning as a way to bring breakthroughs about are not pursuing a very promising approach, because the central planners are not going to be able to predict the components that you need to have successful breakthroughs. That's not the kind of system that will allow the breakthroughs to happen and encourage them. So central planning is, if I'm right in my description of what was happening in this case and other cases, central planning is not going to be a successful strategy to increase innovation. Steve Jobs, he's one of our last people to talk about. It would be interesting to ask Daryl what that tells us about a person's emotions. The picture on the right, maybe that identifies as intensity. That's what I'm calling it anyway, is intensity. That's one of the aspects of Steve Jobs that I want to talk about. Steve Jobs didn't exactly grow up poor, but he certainly wasn't privileged. His family was what you might call working class. His father was an auto mechanic. And they scrimped and saved to send him to college. And he felt so bad about them spending so much of their life savings on that he says that's one of the reasons he dropped out after a year, is he felt guilty about how the sacrifice that his parents were having to make. But he did a lot of innovations that we know about and care about. He was one of the key people to bring the personal computer to the world. And then toward the end of his life, he did other innovations such as the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, those sorts of innovations. I'll just say a quick word about the little poem at the upper left. That's something that I wrote several years ago when they had a competition to write the best haiku about the U.S. economy. And it was a period of time when there was several years of fairly low employment, high unemployment, in other words. And a haiku has to follow a certain number of syllables in each of the three lines, and this does do that. The punctuation is intended and important. So Jobs lowercase and Jobs uppercase, Steve, are gone. Need more Jobs uppercase, Steve. To get more Jobs lowercase, innovate to grow. And this is my 5 seconds of fame. The Economist magazine from Britain, they did an online survey of their readers about which of the submitted haiku was the best, the most popular. It turned out mine won the vote. So I had 5 seconds of fame for my haiku. But the point of the haiku was something that's worth noting briefly, which is that the source of new jobs is not small firms per se. What it is, and this has been shown especially by a guy named Haltwanger, an economist named Haltwanger, and a bunch of co-authors in a bunch of papers and books. What they found is that the creator of new jobs are the young startups that grow fast. It's a small part of startups. Most startups never grow. And a small part of them grow fast. Well, the reason we had the slowdown in job creation starting in the mid-2000s and lasting for several years, according to my view, is because we didn't have as many startups, and the startups that were starting up were not growing fast, and so you didn't have the job creation. That's the source of job creation. And who creates those kinds of fast-growing startups? Well, people like Steve, I'm going to go back here for a second, some people like Steve Jobs. Right? There's many books about Steve Jobs. I like this book best of the ones I've read. This book is by Schlender and Tetzelli. Schlender knew Jobs quite a bit. And it's a more nuanced book than the more well-known book by Isaacson on Steve Jobs. I want to talk about one particular characteristic of Jobs that's controversial and is in the news almost every day. USA Today, when I first arrived here a couple days ago, the cover, first page, had an article about this issue. The issue is, does innovation require a violation of work-life balance? And therefore, is innovation something we should avoid? And the article in USA Today had to do with Facebook. But the issue is often discussed in terms of Jobs, because Jobs with the Macintosh, but also his other projects, was very intense. That's intense, right? Intensity. And when he was younger, he was not only intense, but sometimes intense in a way that was kind of mean. He would criticize people as being stupid or lazy or other terms that were bad. He would say that to employees, and they had to have a thick skin and resilience to not be really upset about that. This book makes a point that I think is important, that the other books don't make as much, which is Steve Jobs stayed intense. That was his look at the beginning, that was his look at the end. But he became less gratuitously mean as he got older. In other words, they say becoming, the implication is Steve Jobs not only tried to improve technology, Steve Jobs tried to improve Steve Jobs. And that he viewed not only the technology as a work in progress, he viewed himself as a work in progress. And according to this book, and I think it makes a good case, he had some success. He didn't die a perfect person. Few of us do, right? But he died a better person than he was when he started. But I want to talk about this issue of intensity because I think it's important and it's a possible objection to some of what I'm trying to say. And I have brought, if I can get them to work, I brought a couple of little video clips. And it's from a movie documentary that was done on Steve Jobs that was actually very critical of him, mainly on this issue. The high point of the video, they use this in the trailers. Some of the trailers are still on YouTube, I think, including one of the ones I'm going to show you. But they highlight this guy whose picture you see, Bob Bellevue. And I'm going to show you a clip of the interview with Bob Bellevue, and then I'm going to show you another clip of a continuation of the interview. Bellevue was high in the Mac team that produced this huge innovation. And he is highlighted as somebody who paid a high cost for that. And I want to look at that. I want to talk about it, that first part, and then I want to show a second part and say a word or two about that. And we'll see if I can remember the best way to do this. Okay. I click video 1, and if I'm lucky, it'll pop up. What? Did I do something wrong?
They've ever worked in their life.
Oh, it's up.
Some of them will tell you it was, the happiest they've ever been in their life. But I think all of them will tell you that it is certainly one of the most intense and cherished experiences they will ever have in their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did.
So, it's some of those things you are not sustainable for some people.
I ended up changing my entire life. I lost my wife in that process. I lost my children in that process. I lost the whole structure of my life was just changed forever by going and working on the Mac.
Because the work became so intense?
The work was intense. The commitment needed to do it was intense. I would go into work on a Tuesday morning and half the people would hate me. And I'd come back on Wednesday morning and half the people would hate me, but it was the other half. There were an awful lot of prima donnas in that outfit, so I was always in conflict.
Here's the piece you wrote. You wanna read it?
Steve's passing did come as a bit of a shock for me. For a bit more than 3 years, 1982 to 1985, we were together a lot of the time. We made a dozen trips to Japan together. We were close. After that, I only saw him a few times. I haven't seen him in many years. He was an extraordinary person in many ways, and quite normal in others.
So let's pause for a second after that little clip. If that's what you watch, and I think it's hard to not be moved by that, it makes you very skeptical of whether or not innovation of the sort that Steve Jobs did is justifiable, because this makes the case that it ruins people's lives, this kind of intensity. And this is partly the idea. This is the kind of story that's behind wanting to increase regulations of the labor market, wanting to enforce rules that limit the hours of work you can ask people to put in, that limit the number of days you can ask people to come in, that limit the limitations on vacations that some firms have. In other words, limit the actual work rules that are involved with intensity, right? And so the question then is that a good policy? And you might say, based on this, hearing Belleville and thinking about people like Belleville, that yes, we need to protect him from what happened to him at Mac. Now, I want to ask you to watch another 40 seconds of the interview that followed what you just saw, where Belleville continues to comment on his experiences and on what he was handed is he was handed a tribute. Oh. Is it stopped? Okay. I just want to say this. He was handed when Steve Jobs died. Belleville was moved to write what was called a tribute. You heard the first few seconds of it. The second clip is going to give you some of the rest of what he wrote in this tribute that he wrote to Steve Jobs. So.
That bag of goodies. The iPod, The iPhone and the iPad are so personal. They are warm in your hand. They sing to you when you're alone. They are caressed. In those 3 years together, I packed in a decade or two of experience. Steve packed in a couple of centuries. In his 56 years, he did everything he wanted, and all on his own terms. It was a life well and fully lived, even if it was a bit expensive for those of us who were close.
So then, what do you make of that? I'm not sure exactly, but I do think this. It seems to me like you sure shouldn't mandate intensity because there are trade-offs. Economists are always unpopular because they emphasize trade-offs. And I don't. But on the other hand, should we allow some people to choose intensity? That's a question. And it does seem to me that if you think about the second clip, even Belleville, who is the paradigm example of somebody who was hurt, it's hard to know on balance how he would come down based on that second clip, right? Because on the one hand, he paid a big price in terms of his personal life. But on the other hand, it's clear from the way he talked about it in poetic terms that he's in love with these things like the iPhone, right? And that he thinks it's wonderful. And that he even has mixed feelings about the thinking back of the experiences of the intense time he had with Steve Jobs. So what I think is this. Here's my 2 cents worth, and I'm still thinking on this, so maybe it'll change. But I think it's clear that sometimes intensity benefits us all as consumers, because then we have the Macintosh available to us. We have the iPhone available to us, and the iPod and the iPad. So as consumers, intensity can be a neat thing. The harder issue, what about as workers and as entrepreneurs? And there, I think, reasonable people can disagree and argue, because you do give up something personally. But it seems to me that at least it should be a choice, that we don't all have perfect information about what the good life is. We're all trying to figure that out for ourselves. And that we should have a right to choose work-life balance, and there'll be plenty of firms that'll offer that. But if occasionally somebody like Steve Jobs comes along and wants to pursue an intense project and somebody wants to sign up for it, we shouldn't, by our work rules and regulations, forbid that from happening. That's my 2 cents worth on that really important, controversial issue. So what other lessons can we learn from Steve Jobs? I've talked about the one on the top. One lesson that I haven't talked about too much is that he's another example of somebody without a huge amount of credentials who still made good. And innovative entrepreneurs, the ingredients, you can learn important tools in college and in high school. If Walt Disney had had better courses in contracting, he might not have lost Oswald, right? He might have known how to write the contract up so that in the end it couldn't be stolen. So there's skills and knowledge that can be taught. But there's some also aspects of innovative entrepreneurship that are not so easily teachable, but that still are crucial. Another lesson, and he's one more example, that self-funding at an early stage is going to be crucial. He and Wozniak's most valuable asset was an HP calculator. Calculators now are cheap, so this isn't real to you. But the original HP calculators cost many hundreds of dollars a piece. And if you were somebody like Wozniak, a poor techie, that was your prized possession. Steve Jobs sold his van. Wozniak sold his HP calculator to pool a little bit of money together to start things going in Jobs' father's garage, right? Making a ding in the universe. Steve Jobs had a famous encounter with John Sculley when he was trying to bring Sculley in as CEO of Apple. Sculley had been a vice president at Pepsi, and the famous line that Jobs used with Sculley when he was trying to bring him on board was to say, well, do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugar water, or do you want a chance to make a ding in the universe? Sculley decided he wanted to take a chance at making a ding in the universe. Didn't work out as well as he hoped. But that was what Jobs wanted to do, I think, make a ding in the universe. When he came back, when they brought him back to Apple after his exile, he agreed to come back to Apple for $1 a year. I mean, he clearly wasn't prioritizing the biggest yacht in the world. although in the end he had enough money he could buy a big yacht. He found big yachts boring, actually. So that's Steve Jobs. I just have a couple more points I want to make. This is my tour of some important innovators and entrepreneurs. But there's one question I haven't directly addressed, which I think is an important one that some of you may care about. And I've touched on it, but not directly. The question is, can we, you and I, if we decided we wanted to, do we have a shot at being breakthrough inventors or innovative entrepreneurs? And this is a controversial issue, and it depends partly on your view of what are the ingredients of becoming innovative, and that people are still working on. Two books I think are encouraging in a way on this issue, encouraging for us. One is by Kevin Ashton. It's How to Fly a Horse. And I can tell you if there's time later after sometime I explain the title. But Peter Thiel, 0 to 1. Kevin Ashton says that in the end, the most important ingredient of breakthrough innovation is that you work harder than the people who are not making the breakthrough innovations. In other words, the key is not epiphany, it's not inspiration, it's not genius, it's hard work. Right? Peter Thiel says the key is courage. More important than anything else, when you are at that moment where you see something that nobody else sees and you decide you're going to fight for it, you're going to be alone. And it is hard to be alone. It takes courage to be alone, defending what you think is true and nobody else thinks is true. So Ashton says it's perseverance. Thiel says it's courage. So the good news is all of us could be innovative entrepreneurs. It doesn't require inspiration or that you're born with a high IQ or genius. The bad news is it takes a couple things that are very hard to do. It takes perseverance and it takes courage. It takes a lot of work. So I do want to say that people who have genius or they think differently can have some advantages for some innovations. So even though you and I may be thinking ordinarily, there is a literature that I want to explore. This is sort of the next thing I'm going to do after I get the book out the door. I want to look more deeply at how some people have argued that people who think differently in certain ways can have advantages in creating certain sorts of innovations. And there's various tantalizing clues on this. Tyler Cowen, who's a well-known economist, argues that some kinds of autism may make it easier to be an innovative entrepreneur because they make it easier for you to have courage. You're not as sensitive to other people's feelings, so you don't know that they are making fun of you when you're asserting something that you're the only person asserting. Gail Saltz has argued that certain sorts of psychological situations like bipolar can have some advantages in terms of some kind of creation. This is cognitive diversity, in other words. Some forms of cognitive diversity, I think, can help people do some sorts of innovations. Bad news is that life is hard if you're cognitively diverse in these ways. The good news is there may be some partially compensating payoff in terms of certain sorts of innovativeness. So my final points on how to encourage innovation, both in terms of policy but also in terms of our own character. I think in terms of our own character, we should tolerate cognitive diversity because I think it can be helpful in some cases. But in terms of most people who are trying to be innovative and can be, the key is to encourage perseverance and courage. Now, in terms of policy, if self-funding is important, as I mentioned it is many times, many examples, then that means we should allow people to acquire the funds to self-fund. And one way that you do that is to try to have taxes not be too high so that people can work, accumulate money, invest it in their dreams. Second point, and I made this a little bit earlier, but I'll make it again, maybe we should have enough confidence and adventuresomeness that we reject the precautionary principle and allow innovators to embark on innovations that we don't know exactly what the harms will be, but we want the world to get better, and we want them to do what they can to try to jump on those rocks up the stream to bring us to a place where the world is better. So what matters in the end? I mentioned at the beginning Deirdre McCloskey, who was responsible for the great fact, the hockey stick. She also has written some good work on how to write well, and she has a wonderful paper called Economical Writing. One of her minor points in this paper is to say that what you put at the end is what matters most of a piece of work, of writing. And what she had, I like what Kevin Ashton has at the end of How to Fly a Horse. At the very end of the book, in the last two sentences, he says, "Necessity is not the mother of invention. You are." Well, I thank you for the privilege of your time and attention, and I hope some of you give it a shot and become innovative entrepreneurs. Thank you.